I'm Lawrence. I'm a senior data scientist or customer delivery architect working for Amazon Web Services. I've been there now almost a bit longer than 5 years. So for some reason, this is my first reInvent. Excitingly enough, when I was young, I was working a lot with Lego robotics. Do you guys know the first Lego League or Lego Mindstorms, those little computers that you program for building robots with Legos? Anybody ever played them or their kids played with them? Yes, fantastic. So when I was a kid, I was competing in these competitions all over the world to build little Lego robots. And I think this is where my passion for technology and machine learning started. Because back then, we didn't have cool algorithms to train these robots. You had to actually program them step by step to achieve certain tasks. But they started doing something smaller, like following a colored line with some small little sensors. And this really got me interested in how all of this works. And the thing with Legos is, of course, that it's comprised of all of these small little elements. And very often when I'm doing sales conversations with customers of ours, I use the allegory of Lego bricks, because you start with, in things like decoupled architectures, you start with little Lego bricks that you build together into a whole. And I think supply chain solutions from an AWS professional services perspective works in a very similar way. We build from something small and go all the way up. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys about accelerating end-to-end supply chain transparency using AI and machine learning. And specifically, I want to focus also a little bit on sort of the nitty-gritty industrial knowledge that goes behind this. Because as a company like AWS, we of course come from the mothership, Amazon, which is very decent at logistics and quite decent at supply chain. And I think we learned a lot from the internal teams there and are able now to sort of like work with our customers on industrial solutions like this. So to start off, I want to dive a little bit into what value chain transparency actually is. And I don't know, this is a conference for techies. Is anyone here actually working in supply chain related businesses? Oh, wow. That's awesome. Well, the supply chain industry hasn't been sitting still. It has been optimizing, it has been improving and getting more and more technology. We're seeing this everywhere. And supply chain is an interesting vertical in some sense, because it isn't really a vertical. It touches every single company that has some product or builds something and sells it to their end customers. So let's talk a little bit about what I did this morning. I woke up in this hotel, the air conditioner was on, and I woke up, I wanted to make a coffee, and I wanted to get a t-shirt out to wear for my talk. And then you have these realizations. You look in the closet, or you look at the coffee bins you're putting into your nice little grinder, and you think, where is this actually coming from? Sometimes I buy my beans, it says sourced from Ethiopia. Or you buy a t-shirt and it's like made in Vietnam. And it's like, okay, how does this actually work? Where is this coming from? And why is it coming all the way from over there? Is it because it's impossible to make here? Or is it because of a different reason? Well, I'm from the Netherlands originally. And a little known fact about our country is that we are actually one of the largest food exporters in the world. We are tiny, but we're the second in the world in exporting food. This is a little supply chain quirk that I find quite interesting, because it's not obvious, it's not common knowledge. And why is this happening? But why don't we know this? And this is really where value chain transparency comes in. Because ironically, a lot of the companies working in this space do not per se have their correct view for themselves either. And this is, of course, the big challenge when you work with a large supply chain that is not fully integrated. So let's say you're a CPG or an apparel company, and you're a retailer, you sell to customers. You have a core supplier that maybe provides you the near finished product. Maybe you do in-house design. You know where that is coming from. You have things like chain of custody documents. You have transaction flows. You have POs that tell you about where this is coming from. But where are they getting their items from? Where are they getting their raw materials from? This is where it sort of starts becoming more difficult. So as I'm saying here, on the right side, you have high visibility. You know where things are coming from. You have visibility on L1 or level 1 of your supply chain. On the right, on the other hand, we have the non-integrated part of your supply chain. What is the supply chain of your supplier? And this is where L2, L3, and L4 occurs, and where we just don't have a view of what is happening. And this is not because companies are malicious or they don't want to tell their customer where things are coming from. It is just a very difficult challenge. There's a few concerns that happen here, of course, right? You have concerns from your supplier. Why should they share this information with you? First of all, it's very costly, right? It can be, if you have to deal with 20 customers you're selling to and they're all asking for information about every single item, why this is not your core business. Secondarily, there can also be deep worries about disintermediation. Like, why are you needing to have the information about where I get my stuff from? This is the secret sauce. This is the juice. Like, I don't want to give this away, but then you're going to just bypass me, maybe. From a data perspective, this is also a huge problem. There is no centralization happening here. We're talking here about an explosion in the number of entities you have to deal with. Even if you are just one company, maybe you work with 10 suppliers, and those 10 suppliers work with another 100 suppliers, and it quickly expands and increases the amount of suppliers you need to work with. All of these come with different data formats, different providers of data, and these formats are not consistent. So getting this information through, even if you ask very nicely and they give it to you, it still can be very difficult to do something with it. It's a very manual process. It's very difficult to sort of like handle this data and put it anywhere. How do you link it with your own internal processes? And this is really what the crux of the problem is in supply chain transparency. Because collating all of that data and putting it together and making informed decisions with that is what it is. Some additional challenges that we see is around levels of measuring. Like, how do you measure? Do we say one batch has one origin, or is it by serial number? I worked with a large apparel company, and they get cotton, and cotton gets farmed in, for instance, in China a lot, or Vietnam. And these are small local farmers that will sell their cotton on the sort of like market to a secondary supplier, and they bundle it up together in big batches, and then it gets sent forward. Most of the time, it's coming from the same region, so this is all right. But in reality, if you need full end-to-end transparency, it could be that these bales of cotton are merged from different locales that might have different regulatory requirements for you. And this is where the really nitty-gritty decisions need to be made. Another challenge here is things like entity versus location. Like, if you have a large company that sells cotton in China, it might be that they have 17 subsidiaries that are located in different regions across China or in Southeast Asia. So what do you track? Who is the one that you're working with? Where is it being sourced from? Can you, with confidence, say about your product that you know that this t-shirt originated from this farm? Or do you only know that it came from this entity that happens to have farms in a set of locations? And these kind of granularity questions are really important. Supply chains are very complex. I remember, I think it was a year and a half ago, I was outside. It was very sunny in Amsterdam where I live, and I had just moved houses. And my new house had a beautiful rooftop, and I wanted to get a barbecue to hang out with my friends on the rooftop. It's a good time. So I went to this shop in my street, and they sell barbecues. So I went, hey, do you have a barbecue? And they said, well, normally we do. Unfortunately, we don't currently. We can't get them. I'm like, what do you mean you can't get them? It's a barbecue. It's not a very difficult piece of technology, I would assume. Where are you getting them normally from? And then he tells me, well, I was confused as well, but it turns out my supplier sources these from China, and they were on a boat, the next batch, and that boat is currently stuck near the Panama Canal in Egypt because the Evergreen had blocked the canal. And I don't know if you guys remember the Evergreen boat, but this was one singular boat that blocked global trade for about a month, and the small tail effect of that I could not buy a small barbecue in the summer. The supply chains have gotten so insanely complex that we are, and this is in a lot of ways a good thing because it allowed us to get fruits in different parts of the summer that aren't able to be farmed in the Netherlands, or cheap, well-made items from different locales that can be imported. Global trade is a very interesting machine. But it's also very fragile and brittle because of this. And if you are a vendor or you're a product CPG company, if you don't know where these things are coming from, this comes with incredible risks associated to them as well. Because how can you cover, do KYC, so to say, or not cover your ass if you don't know where things are coming from? How can you have a good sourcing strategy? So what does one of these supply chains look like, right? I was talking about it earlier that you have these different levels. And I was talking also about how this number of entities kind of explodes really fast. And you can see this here, right? So we have our head office, and we are a very proud company, and we do design in-house, and we make t-shirts, for instance. And as you can see, that goes into sort of like a forecasting and planning location where we do stock and assortment, where we have procurement people doing POs, figuring out based on new trends analysis or what people are going to be buying. And based on that, we are putting in orders. And then you have warehouses and transport in between, and that goes down to the sourcing and manufacturing location. And this is spread across the globe, and this can be highly complex. Even just a singular product, if you sell that, can have a supply chain that involves maybe 100 entities. That is quite a lot already, right? Because maybe it's comprised of 7 different types of fiber if you have a t-shirt. That's 7 different locales already that you need to be sourcing from. And before it becomes a fiber, it needs to also be harvested. So you can see that it quickly explodes in the number of entities that you're dealing with. And like we know, L1 transparency is doable, but then it sort of falls off really quickly. So noting that this is quite complex and can be quite challenging, why are we doing this? I mean, that's always the big ask, right? Sometimes, we have the technology, but is there a reason for doing this? And I think there's sort of like 4 main categories that we see in the industry for people having reasons to do something about transparency. There's some market sentiment here. Consumers are asking for this. So when you're talking about the CPG industry and the apparel industry, for instance, the coffee beans and the t-shirts, there's a huge change of expectations from customers that want and demand transparency. McKinsey has done some excellent research in the state of apparel in 2021, where they found that more than 50% of customers or consumers, they consider transparency now an immediate and necessary need for a brand's product. And they choose, with their money, what type of brand's products they buy based on the available information they can find for it. It's also important from a realness perspective, because knowing where things are sourced from allows you to protect against counterfeiting. From your producers, from your retailers, and for consumers. It allows you to emphasize that this is a real product. This was made in the appropriate supply chain of my company. There's obviously the second category, compliance and regulation. There's the proactive side and the sort of like reactive side to this, right? We see globally, Europe is quite far ahead with this, with things like ESRP already, that we see a growing number of regulations. This is happening. It's in Europe since 2022 now. We have a quite broad regulation around transparency requirements for CPG and apparel, and specifically focused on things like conflict and non-sustainable sourcing. It is not that it's not allowed to get fibers that were not organically made. It's just that there are going to be limitations on this. We also see that there's a constantly changing environment, right? So these rules update and change, they aren't staying constant. So from a company's perspective, it's very important to sort of be able to be ahead of the curve. If you are proactive in this, it's not only easier to comply in the future with new regulations, but it becomes necessary. The third pillar we're seeing here is really the sustainability angle. We are here in the SUS, this stands for sustainability. That's partly what the session is also about. And we find that a significant amount of CPOs, for instance, see that purchasing decisions are really led around sustainability. We're also seeing that from an investor perspective, ESG goals are becoming more and more important. This is sort of like a no-brainer from a company's view. Holding companies like BlackRock, for instance, that do large investments, they consider ESG as an important category. Finally, there's also the risk element. So purely from a business perspective, why bother, right? Well, insight in your supply chain allows you to de-risk. If you realize that even though you use maybe 10 different L1 suppliers, but they all converge back to the same L4 supplier, this is a problem. This is a real risk. We saw this with my customer PVH that I'll be talking about a bit later as well. During COVID, there was a huge problem with getting cotton from China during COVID. And it wasn't so much that all of their suppliers were using cotton from China, but a lot of them were. But they didn't have this visibility because this was on an L4 level, the farm level. And suddenly you're stuck with having to reorganize and finding new suppliers. So insight into where things are coming from allows you to sort of like generate a bunch of use cases on top of that to optimize your business further. For the rest, we also see a significant amount of sentiment just from an industry perspective. So I was talking a little bit about these 4 pillars, some data to back this up. So CPOs were asked, like, what are you seeing in your companies? What are you seeing in your environment? And I selected a few of these statements that I think are interesting. So for instance, we're seeing that not only is a customer sentiment driving this, but also we're seeing that new garments, for instance, apparel, are going to be more built around recyclable fibers because this is a demand from the consumer. We're seeing that almost all the brands want to have transparency around their tier 3, both for de-risking, but also for transparency from a consumer and a regulatory perspective. And finally, we're seeing a lot of a focus on ecological footprint. And this really goes into sort of like what we call scope 3 decarbonization. Scope 3 decarbonization is a term that I learned a while back. It was new for me, but it's essentially when you look at sort of the carbon impact that you have as a company in your production processes, there's different scopes. You have scope 1, which is sort of like your internal processes that generate carbon emissions. Scope 2 is sort of like external processes, like for instance energy usage that that you need to have for fulfilling your mission that cause carbon footprint. But then you also have scope 3, which is sort of the largest part of the carbon footprint of a company, which is really the supply chain carbon. So it's not really your production process, it's not the things that are adjacent to your production process, but it's everything from L1 to L4 that is needed and fed into your company. So you see this, for instance, here, the split of where these carbon emissions are coming from. You have some around consumer use, you have a smaller percentage than I expected around transport, and then you get into manufacturing, raw materials, and things like fabric production. And this is from a retailer perspective is really important, right? Because only when you have the where, the how, and the what, you can then, first of all, track the footprint to be able to make informed decisions whether you want to change something, maybe source from a different location. You can quantify the impacts, right? So knowing where things are being sourced from, and suddenly you know very well that you're over-relying on one location, or maybe we can move things closer by, or maybe we can do disintermediation to reduce the footprint that we have. And finally, this results to you being able to do remediation across your value chain. So I think I give a decent overview of like why we need to do this and what people are saying and what people are wanting to do. But what do we see as solutions here, right? We talked a little bit about why this is important. We talked a little bit about that consumers want to see it. But what are people actually doing with this? So I highlighted a few solutions that are happening in the industry right now. One of them is a very simple one, a traceability map. So you want to be able to highlight on a category, on a SKU, on a batch, or on a serial number, where things are being made. What is my L1 to L4 process? So you see a little map in a dashboard that shows you for your SKU number 5, it originated first here, your L4 was in China, your L3 was in Turkey, and then we went to Egypt, and then it was distributed across in Europe. That's a simple example. That's on a SKU level, but you can of course aggregate this up also to sort of see what areas are my L4s located in, etc. You essentially create a sort of like data set that gives you deep insight on where things are being sourced from and allows you to make better decisions in the future about changing that sourcing strategy in the first place. Because cost is not obviously a natural factor, but risk needs to be costed in as well. This is a huge one that we see, and this is already quite difficult because the data is not available, and I'll dive into that a little bit deeper. Because how do you know where your supplier's supplier gets his supplies? And this is really where industry partners come in. It's very difficult without full vertical integration to get insight in this kind of information. So if you want to know where an entity is located and where this is being made, and are they doing it sustainable? Well, you can send one of your people in your company across the world to visit every single supplier that you work with, or every single vendor, and then also your vendor's vendor and your supplier's supplier. But this is a very inefficient thing and doesn't really scale very well. So have talked about this, and a lot of industry NGO partners have sort of sprung up to sort of like cover this need. So what we see, companies like Fairtrade, Textile Exchange, or the Climate Pledge Friendly are essentially NGOs that verify that a supplier is able to produce a certain type of material in a sustainable manner. For instance, you can do organic cotton well, and that is allowed, and here is the proof that you are able to do it. So they handle sort of like the non-centralized work for other companies as a bit of effort. And this helps everyone in the industry. The second part is, of course, the data providers that are behind this, right? Because now we have the knowledge that somebody is verified to be sustainable. We also need to have geolocation on those L4 to L1 vendors. And this is what you do with data providers that you buy data sets from that are focused and specific to a specific industry. For instance, you have Textile Genesis, as you can imagine, focused on textiles. Places like FiberTrace, SourceMap, or TrustTrace. These are partners that we work with as AWS and also our customers work with that provide deep information about individual vendors. And again, centralizing this data collection effort so that you don't have to so that the inefficiency disappears. Because otherwise, every single apparel company has to do the same thing. And now we have one company doing it and providing this information to have a better and more sustainable world. Without this data, it's incredibly difficult to get this end-to-end transparency. And this is really also, I think, where AWS comes in, because we are not going into these individual vendors to say hi and ask them about the sustainability certificates, but rather, we take this data and we build a platform that allows us to connect this with your internal data. So I mentioned these certificates. This is a quick high-level overview of another industry solution that we're seeing. So these NGOs essentially provide certificates, we call them scope and transaction certificates, to an individual vendor. A scope certificate saying, I, vendor XYZ, am allowed to make products using organic cotton. And a transaction certificate that then backlinks this verification to an individual transaction occurring with this company. An individual PO, even as far as that. Because from a regulatory perspective, you need to not only work with companies that are able to do sustainable sourcing, but you need to prove that the individual transactions are sustainable sourced. And this all leads into sort of like a dream, so to say. Something we call the dream of the product passport. And I'm sure many of you guys have heard of the product passport already. And this is a common refrain, but this was often seen as very difficult or impossible to provide. With the changing sentiments that we're seeing in the industry, we are also realizing that this is not going to just become a nice to have, but almost an essential for CPG companies in the future. To be able to scan a QR code on the label and see my coffee beans arrived here in this port and was sourced from this location in this farm. Same thing with apparel. For the t-shirt, I want to know where all the individual pieces are coming from. Where were the raw materials sourced? And are they sustainable? And this allows the company to prove to their consumer that they are doing their part. The internal benefits, obviously, I already mentioned, right? You can do proactive risk reduction on the inside. But on the outside, it's really proactive compliance with regulatory amendments like the ESRP, as I mentioned before, but also just giving people more information about what they are going to buy to increase that transparency. So these are sort of like the industry solutions we're seeing. Now I want to spend some time talking a little bit about what we see as AWS about this. Like, how do we approach this kind of problem? Because these are sort of like use cases and enablers. But how does AWS deal with this? And for this, we go into something we call the system of systems. And the system of systems is essentially a solution guidance we released last year after working with our customer PVH when we built a transparency portal for them. The solution guidance for product traceability on AWS is aligned. I have a QR code at the end if you're interested to take a look at it. But it's essentially a data mesh for supply chain transparency. So what we do, and I have a little bit of an exemplary analysis on the left. So let's take a singular example. We have, as our company, a PO. Maybe it's PO number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it contains, as we know, because we have the shipping documents that we received and the chain of custody documents that we received, it contains 142 kilograms of NGO-certified organic cotton. And this is cross-checked by us using machine learning extracted transaction certificates that we have gotten through the NGO business that we work with and the data providers we work with. And this is validated by one of these NGOs, like, for instance, Textile Exchange. So what we're doing here is essentially combining 4 different pieces of data. We start with your internal standard data, PO data. Hey, I have a purchase order for some set of items. You match this up with your inventory information. You match this up with your customer data, and finally you attach the partner data. And this cross-linking of all of these data points allows you to get this transparent view over your supply chain. Because otherwise you only have a limited view of what is happening. And I always like explaining this sort of like in a very simple manner. So this is what sort of the standard view is when you go to a company. Let's say we have on the left axis, we have the level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. And I'm trying to sort of like highlight here the visibility that we have as a company of our suppliers. So it starts with, we know what L1 is doing most of the time. Let's say this is 3 SKUs that we are interested in. We know what they are doing, and we have a little bit of coverage around what they are doing. On L2, we see some coverage. Perhaps we know what type of relationships our supplier has, but we don't really know further than that. And we have no idea. So once you start working with this kind of data mesh and you start attaching this partner data, it starts looking a little bit more like this. So now we start getting a bit of a coverage. We're seeing, for L2, we start seeing some things happening because we worked with Fibertrace, who has good coverage for cotton-based fabrics, for instance. Now we attach a second partner. Besides Fibertrace, let's also add in Textile Genesis. Okay, so now we have not just cotton, but now we can see also, for instance, some leather products. Okay, we get better coverage and we get some more insights deeper down the value chain. Now, with 3 data partners, it increases even further. But you're still noticing, and this is what I like to call a bit the fog of war, is you're still noticing there's gaps, because this is relatively a new business, these data providers. And these gaps are sometimes really hard to fill in, because you have some visibility, but it's like Pareto's principle, right? The first 60%, 70% is doable, and then you get into the problematic parts of it, the really small subsidiaries, I was talking to my customer, and he was explaining to me that they work with one vendor that sells a very specific type of magnet for one SKU that they make for a clothing item, that instead of a zipper, it has a magnet closure. So there's one guy in the world that makes these. Well, this is helpful for them because they think it's an interesting story, so they know the guy and they have a relationship with him. But if you now are talking about something less esoteric, we have hundreds of cotton providers. We have no visibility here. And this is where this comes in. But to lift this fog of war one step further, we start introducing ML technologies into it. To fill in the fog of war a little bit, we use sort of like double approach for ML. One of them is sort of like an automation component, and one is sort of like what we call collation. And this is really where you get into this system of systems approach. So one, we need to start with our internal data sources. We have information about, for instance, our products, like we know the date, the product style, the SKU number, purchase orders, lots, transaction IDs, the quantities. These are essentially just a view over your internal database that can already exist. And you know what kind of coverage you have over this. Second step, we can add the partner data. We can both get, okay, we know what supplier we're using for this PO, what is the location data for that supplier so we can track this over. What about the sustainability status? What about a bunch of other rules that we need to comply with? So you add these data sources and you see sort of like a coverage map being created. And then you complete your traceability data set at the end. And that's really what the point of this data mesh is, because once you have a completed traceability set at the end, you can generate use cases with them. And then we finalize this by augmenting it further with machine learning. The gaps are sort of like being filled in using classic NLP methods and generative AI. And for this, we have built this product traceability solution, and it tries to sort of corroborate the multiple sources. So for instance, if we have two partners providing the same piece of data point about a supplier, this is a high probability of being correct. If we have 3 partners, even better. If we have 4 partners, even better. Whilst if we have 0 coverage, we try to infer it a little bit using data from the other partners. So let's talk a little bit about architecture. We released this as a product guidance for the sustainability, under the sustainability guidance, and this was created in tandem with my customer PVH. So what we see here is sort of like a lot of different blocks, and this is where I'm referring back to the Lego blocks that I was talking about in the beginning. Legos is nice, and I think AWS services sometimes are a bit like Legos. You connect them together and they become a whole. And what we do here is on the top, is first we combine and take all of the internal data, like ERP data, PLM data, VMS data, maybe some information uploaded on SharePoint, like unstructured PDFs, scans of chain of custody documents, scans of these certificates. And we have also a web portal where we allow external suppliers to manually upload them. Because one of the things is with working with your suppliers is that one of the if you're a large enough CPG, we nowadays ask our customers to upload this kind of information to our systems immediately so that we can use it downstream for this transparency data set. So this data comes in. We use a set of technologies standard ETL processing, things like AWS Glue and Amazon S3. And then that goes into a final consumption layer where we do Amazon Redshift and Amazon Athena, and then a dashboarding solution like QuickSight or Tableau. But we also have this whole certificate aspect, and this is really where it becomes difficult. So you notice perhaps that SharePoint is listed here. And in the past, what was happening before we were engaging with this customer is that we had people putting in manual hours to read one of these PDFs, try to extract the relevant information and write it into a big Excel sheet. As you can imagine, this does not scale very well, and this worked maybe for the beginnings, but after that it broke down. So this is where we introduced machine learning services at AWS to do automatic certificate extraction and collation. So you see in block number 4, after we have uploaded the documents, we use a combination of AWS services to extract entities and information from these documents. So we start with Amazon Textract to read in the PDFs and the scans of the documents, and then pull out the relevant information. So we have in our mind already what kind of view we want to have at the end. So we need to have a certain sort of like unique join key, right? Because we know our internal sort of view. We know the PO, we know the SKU number, we know the shipment number, and we need to relate that back, and we have the supplier information, and we need to relate that back to these individual certificates, both on a scope level and on a transaction level. So we pull out the relevant data, and these are very gnarly PDFs, I might add. Like you can imagine, this will a transaction certificate that comprises of 10 POs split into 17 different shipments with all the different weights and values coming from different locations, but in one document. So we use a combination of text-extract, classical NLP, and generative AI to extract this information from it. This then finally gets verified with a bunch of internal business rules and then bound together with these other data sets we had created. And we do this for every single partner. So we start with the certificates, we do location service with the location service partners, and we bind this all together with our own internal PO system and VMS system. And this finally then goes to your dashboarding solution, allowing you to build use cases on top of this new lake of data, which has the transparency information attached from the get-go. Diving a little bit into how we do the ML. So we use a combination of some new services and old services. We start with standard text extract. We need to turn the PDFs or the documents into machine-readable information. So that we extract the text, we extract the tables, and we use some generative AI to ask very specific questions about the document. For instance, these documents don't always have a standard structure. And so we ask, who is the consignee in this case, or who is the supplier of this document? And that way, generative AI, using Amazon Bedrock, reads this document and returns back the individual entity to us in a specifically parsed structure. So we use certain guardrails to force it not to return 10 sentences, but just our answer in a sort of like JSON structure. The collation happens after the fact, so we do a lot of verification. I was mentioning earlier that we sort of like, want to weigh the probabilities of the value or the information of a data partner being correct. I started off by talking about sometimes the decisions you have to make around transparency are really difficult. Are you listing serial number, or are you focusing on the bale of cotton? Like, what granularity are we looking at? And the same thing occurs with these data partners, is that not always they provide the granularity on the same level. So we use some heuristics and some classical ML to sort of like infer the middle, so to say, to find sort of like the accurate assessment here. And this allows us to then again, bind it to the original data set and create visibility with internal dashboards and externally facing products like a product passport. So I give you guys a lot of theory so far. I think theory is good. This is quite a complex topic. But I also want to talk a little bit about my customer that we worked with together. So who here knows about PVH? 2 people in the room, fantastic. Well, PVH is maybe a little unknown because it's a holding company in a lot of ways, but they hold 2 really famous brands. So they own, for instance, Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger. They're a very large apparel company and they do in-house design. And PVH has worked together with us last year, a product I like to call from cotton bud to cocktail dress to find the full end-to-end transparency of their apparel distribution. So we see this in the traceability and sustainability platform that we built with them. And PVH is quite interesting because I was talking earlier about how the L1 to L4 quickly explodes like a pyramid. And you see, for instance, that even though they have 2 brands, they already work immediately with 200 vendors, more than 300 mills, 150 spinners, 300 ginners, almost 100 cotton farms. And that's just one type of the product. And also, every year, they introduce more than 60,000 new styles. And they ship 150 million pieces. So suddenly the scale starts to be boggling. Like, how do we manage this? How do we get transparency on that level for all of these individual styles and products? So we worked together and we implemented this data mesh system of systems that I was just talking about with them to allow them to get a view and build use cases on top of that. So that view really starts making sense by going back to the initial visual I showed you guys of the supply chain. So this is PVH supply chain in a sort of simplified manner. We again have the stores to the distribution to the sourcing around L1 to L3. And I listed here sort of like on the top some of the use cases that we built on top of this data mesh that we created. So we have an OSS dashboard, which stands for one-stop shop for certificates. Can I see as a designer immediately what styles and what types of cotton I can use with what vendors to ensure that we adhere to our sustainability goals? What about geotracking? I can see and zoom in immediately where my raw materials are being sourced from and where they are coming from. If I select a certain SKU, I can see on the map where it came from, allowing us to do proactive risk reduction for our sourcing strategy. Similarly, this goes directly into the sourcing dashboard, right? So what about instead of an individual SKU, we look at groups of materials. And finally, because the platform is flexible, because it's a data mesh with on top of that use case generation, we can expand this continuously further. And this is still an active product development together with PVH. So we see that we pull some data from these data vendors like GI, Textile Genesis that I was mentioning earlier. And we also pull data from the certificates using machine learning that I was mentioning before. And then we combine this with the internal data, things like VMS and PO systems. And we highlight and finally link it with product data around things like PLM. And this all binds together into multiple sort of like, data structures that we can then downstream use for a dashboard. For instance, this is a dashboard that we made where we have the certificates view. So in this case, what you can see is you have vendors listed on the left. You have a region and a country where they are located. And then we can have for each column a standard. So for instance, GRS or OCS, these are organic cotton standards. And we can see what vendors are certified to be able to produce that for us with full end-to-end transparency in that supply chain. So we can see, I have this vendor in Bangladesh that is certified up to 2024. I would like to work with them for my new design. Or I can go back and, for an audit, prove to my compliance team that indeed it was sourced transparently and sustainability. You can also see that we can see when things are no longer valid and we can ask for an update. Like, hey, did you guys forget about it? Maybe we need to have this because we can't buy it until it's valid again. So that's really the certificate vendor analysis. Then we also have, of course, the obligatory geotracking. Like, where are things actually coming from and how are they being sourced? So you can select the garment, you can select the season, a year, and pull where things are being made, what is being done in that location, and additional information about that locale. So for instance, you select a ginner, we can find immediately whether they are certified, what type of place it is, and whether they are NGO certified to make certain sustainable materials. So these are just two views of the capability that you can generate once you have this data structure created. Because in the end, the dashboard is nice, I think really useful, and that's where the value generation sits. But for it to work, you need to have the data mesh built first. And the data mesh is just a flexible way of allowing you to accelerate and build more use cases on top of it. It's a foundational piece of technology. And what's next? Because I mentioned that the use case generation is sort of the goal here, right? So you have the data mesh. Now we have it. We can keep extending it. We can improve the coverage by adding more data partners, which essentially is just another pipeline of processing. But we can also move to further use cases based on this kind of data mesh. So for instance, we can start doing product recommendations based on environmental impact. We can do design based on environmental impact if I'm a designer internally working. We can also increase the speed to market with insights in things like fabric availability. To prevent those evergreens, even if they crash, we know we have our sourcing strategy de-risked enough that it's not a huge problem. With this, we can optimize sourcing decisions in this exact way to ensure that next time when I want to buy a barbecue, am able to do so. And of course, the future is also an automatic creation of chain of custody, which is sort of the holy grail. It's like where, during shipment, everything was and who was owning it at that very moment over time during the deployment. These are some of the possibilities that we're working on. And then, of course, the final one that I like a lot, because I would like to be and live that dream where I go into a store, and I take out my phone, and I scan a QR code, and I see, this product was made here, and this NGOs tell me this is sustainable sourced, and I'm happy to pay maybe a small premium as a consumer to access this kind of information. The product passport dream, and this is being worked on right now as well, and we will be able to see this in the future, hopefully. So, how can we help? As I was saying in the beginning, I'm part of AWS Professional Services. You can reach out to your account team as a customer and talk to us about sustainable and transparency in the supply chain. We have a lot of industry experts focused on these kind of solutions, and we've also published the product traceability on AWS guidance online. You can find it on the link, or you can try to use the QR code to go there directly. With that, I wanted to thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to be here, and I hope that you guys learned something today. And feel free to add me on LinkedIn or approach me to ask any questions.